Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our monthly, or sort of monthly, irregular meeting of the New York Society for General Semantics. Those of you that are new, this would be the point where you would applaud. Okay, very good. They are trainable.
Nice theater people? Yeah.
Yes.
Actors
We take direction.
Just give us
Well, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Lance Straight. I'm the president of the New York Society for General Semantics, and we're very happy to be sponsoring this event with one of our favorite members, Robin Levenson, and accompanied by a member of our board of directors, Mike Plew. Yes. This for you? Yeah. We want to keep things interesting here. We like to do that. And those of you that are not familiar with our organization, and certainly there's much you can learn about it from our website, and we try to have interesting events here at the Players on a relatively monthly basis. And I know Mike will tell you a little bit more, and through the discussion you can hear a little bit more about what we're about. I just want to say, by way of introduction, that we don't charge a fee for the refreshments or for the event, but we do encourage folks to join the Institute of General Semantics, which is our kind of parent organization, and which you can find, and there are links through our website, or just Googling Institute of General Semantics or generalsemantics.org. And with that membership, you will get a subscription to our quarterly journal, etc., which our journal editor is sitting over here if you want to find out more about it, as well as having an annual Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture. Last year's wasn't so good, I hear, but no, just kidding. Just kidding. And as well as a symposium that follows that folks like these and others make presentations. And if you feel so obliged, there's also a donation button on the New York Society's site. Just want to mention that. Yeah. And at this point, it gives me great pleasure to go sit down and stop talking and turn things over to Mike Plew, who is a professor of communication at Manhattan College, which, in the spirit of the map, is not the territory, is located in the Bronx. Mike. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming. I recognize that at these events sometimes we have a broad range of different backgrounds, and in order to sort of give a brief orientation to what General Semantics is about, so that we can proceed to inject that into a lively conversation about this wonderful book, I'll just mention that in the early 20th century, in the wake of those horrors, World War I and so forth, Count Alfred Korzybski, a Polish mathematician, decided that he'd undertake a mission to increase the sanity of human beings by way of understanding processes of experience and observation and the translations of those experiences and observation into language. His famous expression, "the map is not the territory," is an ode to the idea that while we translate, right, these experiences and observations into language, that sometimes we fall into various kinds of traps. We fool ourselves into believing certain kinds of things, and in doing so create conflict and deprive ourselves of maximizing our sanity, essentially. And so a number of people have written in the great tradition of Alfred Korzybski. Lance, did his duty to mention the Institute of General Semantics and our New York Society for General Semantics, which have both been around for quite a long time and enjoy a great run of work in this vein. And we're here tonight to talk about an exceptional book. I have 3 books on this table, and of course this one is by far the most wonderful, and we'll spend the most amount of time celebrating its author, Robin Levenson, who's a great friend of ours. And in just a moment, I'll transition into why we're all here. But I did want to mention that if there's anything that you hear, if you feel curious about General Semantics and you'd like to learn more, rather than turning you over to some rather thick and difficult books, that the Institute of General Semantics runs its own press and has a book called Selections from Science and Sanity, an Introduction to Non-Aristotelian Systems and General Semantics, selections from Alfred Korzybski's book. It's much thinner than the book from which it derives. And I wanted to just read one passage before we begin talking to Robin today, from a book that I've really came to love through Lance's teaching. A man by the name of Wendell Johnson wrote this book, People in Quandaries, The Semantics of Personal Adjustment. Yes, right? So anyone who knows the book is quite fond of this book. There are many others in the tradition, of course, that you could be introduced to if you were so interested. But there's a passage at the very beginning on page 23 in my edition of this book that I thought I'd read before I introduce Robin and get into her book at greater depth. Sorry. We've gone from a Polish count and mathematician to the story of Heraclitus, a Greek. And at the beginning of this chapter 2 in the book called Never the Same River, Wendell Johnson writes, Heraclitus the Greek cast a long shadow before him. He contended that one cannot step in the same river twice. The Greek was going beyond the assertion that no two things are exactly alike. Wait, let me read that again. The Greek was going beyond the assertion that no two things are exactly alike to the assertion that no one thing is ever twice the same, that reality is to be regarded as a process. And we might enlarge his contention by pointing out that one may not step in the same river twice, not only because the river flows and changes, but also because the one who steps into it changes too, and is never at any 2 moments identical. And I thought that was a very nice way to begin talking about Robin's book, which is about translation, and about the many varieties of performance and script and so forth that will radically change the experience, not only for the performers, but for the audience. And in the spirit of General Semantics, to begin with Heraclitus, we now transition to Chekhov. And I'd like to read from the back of the book to introduce our wonderful friend and author. Robin Beth Levenson completed her BA in French and Dramatic Art at the University of California, Santa Barbara, her MFA in Acting at the University of California, Riverside, and her PhD in Music and Performing Arts at New York University. You want to applaud? She has written articles for communication from the International Brecht Society on Wojciech, thank you, Wojciech. See, I'm out of my depth on that, right? Wojciech and the Seagull.
By Buchner.
By Buchner.
George Buchner.
By George Buchner. See, I'm getting older and my eyes are bad for reading these things now. For Dialogues in Social Justice, an adult education journal on Ta-Nehisi Coates, and for the New York Society for General Semantics on language and Gurdjieff. Thank
Roger.
you. Thank you. As well as publications for the New York State Communication Association, good friends of ours, where she is also on the executive board. She has acted professionally in Los Angeles and New York, on stage and in film. She is currently assistant professor of communication at LaGuardia Community College, CUNY. Her research interests include how language influences thought and behavior and the nature of performance. Please give it up for Robin Levenson. This is really a beautiful accomplishment, and I think you'll agree that Peter Lang and Robin collaborated on creating a very lovely book. I've had the opportunity to read through quite a bit of it at this point, and I feel like I can almost open it to any page and find something really interesting to dive into. You don't have to read it to cover to cover, although that is a wonderful way to experience it. There's just so many wonderful things in here, but as it does have a front cover and a back cover, I thought maybe we'd begin by talking about first living through the experience of writing this and what this meant sort of personally, and then get into some of the early items in the book about translation.
Okay. I got the idea for the book. I wrote my dissertation at NYU, and I was asked to be a PhD candidate. Never thought I would graduate. But the head of the educational theater program there spoke to me, Dr. Lowell Swartzell. I brought in one day to him, just because I thought it was interesting, 7 or 8 first lines of The Cherry Orchard in 7 or 8 different translations. And I said, you know, Lowell, for the actor, these lines are very different. It said, one says, the train is here, I'll go meet it. The next one says, this is the same line, right? I'm late, I need to meet the train. The next line says, I'm tired, will you go meet the train? And these are all Chekhov translations, and I thought, how can they call it a translation when they all say something different? And if you're an actor, you look at the words, and you're going to play it differently if the words are different. And Lowell said, I think you have a dissertation here. And I said, really? He said, yeah, why don't you, compare different translations? And I said, can I do that for a PhD degree? He said, yeah. So I did that, and I spent all these years researching it because I love research. Do you know how many people have written about Anton Chekhov? Thousands and thousands. So when you take, it's like Lance has taken on writing about Neil Postman, or, something that a lot of people have written about. Usually for a dissertation, people don't do that, right? They find a tiny little thing so that they can be the only person. Well, I discovered nobody had compared translations of Chekhov. So I started doing research. I just found another one I forgot to put in the book. I have 146 different translations of the last 4 plays, which are considered his masterpieces. And I did all, 9 years of research and maybe 6 months of writing. And I did that because they told me, you have to get your PhD within 10 years or we don't let you get it. So the last 6 months, I wrote it, and I'm a student. I've written lots of papers and stuff. Every chapter is like a long paper that I wrote, but they all relate to each other. So the writing process, I actually was very lucky. I'll just say this, the last 6 months I wrote, some of you may know, I had a traumatic brain injury, and I was in the hospital. But when I wrote I got better. It was West Nile virus. I was bit by a mosquito. I had a brain injury. Anyway, that's a long story, but because I wasn't working, I had actually 6 months to do nothing but write the book. And that's what I did. 6 months before I graduated, I wrote it. And I don't like the process of writing. It's very difficult. But every once in a while you think, this is a really good thing to say.
So you obviously have spent quite a lot of time thinking about this material and these ideas, and I know we've had conversations about these things over the years before it crystallized in book form. And can you describe a bit about how is this a labor of love for you? I mean, what is it about Chekhov, and what is it about the idea of translation that really grabbed you?
Well, I told you that looking at those different translations, I have an MFA in acting. I have to go back to that. When you get a degree in acting, Shakespeare and Chekhov are things you usually work on because they're difficult. And they're still doing Chekhov every season, almost in New York City and elsewhere. They do Chekhov plays. So this is something I wanted to know about, because when I first read Chekhov, which wasn't till I was actually getting my MFA in theater at UC Riverside, and I actually started acting in scenes and reading the plays, I would read a play in the end of the scene where a woman comes back in, she's been asked, this is an Uncle Vanya, let's ask my husband if he doesn't mind if we play the piano, okay? And she comes back in and says, no, he says we can't, period. End of Act 2, or whatever it is. And I'm going, that's not the end of the scene. I don't think I like this. How can he end scenes in the middle? But then, when I started doing research, I realized Chekhov on the page is actually kind of boring. But it comes alive when actors who have done research on the roles are actually playing it, because you see what, how they say it and what they mean when they say it only in performance. So I got very much interested in performance, and you asked about translation. Why are these translations different? So I started, my first 3 chapters in the book, they may be very boring to a lot of you, because they're about translation. I actually have a brief history of translation itself, going back to the Greeks and a whole bunch of other people through the Enlightenment and all. I talk about all these people who translate, Goethe and everybody, what their ideas are about translation. And then I decided, well, the final 3rd chapter is about the translation as artists, I think, and it involves people like the theater translators, Tom Stoppard and Lanford Wilson and David Mamet. All these people who, by the way, if you didn't know this, they don't speak Russian. They didn't really learn Russian, but they're translating plays. And then somebody told me that they can't do that. Linguists think, how can you translate a play without knowing what they call the source language? I don't speak Russian. One person told me, you can't write a book on Chekhov, Robin. You don't speak Russian. And I said, but I know English. And I'm comparing English translations. And I did look at the Russian translations, mostly for the punctuation, which a lot of people leave out. Anyway, so I realized that this idea, I'm also this is a big deal. I'm a communication teacher. I teach communication studies for the last 5 or 7 years of my life. So communication, translation, they're like, they're very much related to each other. So I started doing research on the nature of translation, and then especially translation for the stage. And mostly what my book is about is how translation for the stage is very different, a different animal than translating novels or poems or technical translation or political treatises and stuff. It's very different because plays, can I go into this?
Go ahead.
Plays are not about words. They have modern, contemporary plays. Shakespeare may be more about words, but plays are not about words. They're about what the character wants to do in the circumstances of the scene. So that brought me to my next chapter, which I call Action. And that was given to me by our, Nick knows about him, our Russian teacher, Yevgeny Lanskoy, who said his definition of action on stage was purpose with movement, or movement plus desire. In other words, you can only be on the stage or move on stage, even if you're sitting still, you want to influence others underneath the words. Because this is, can I just
Yeah, please go ahead. I'm enjoying every second of it, please.
A very short example about how words mean nothing. I love you. I love you. 4 different actions, the same words. What do those words mean? It depends on how you say it, the circumstances that you're in. I just made up the circumstances. All my theater people here are going, well, duh. But people who are not in the theater, when you read a play, you imagine how they're going to say it. So the play is not the words. It's what happens between the characters. Even experimental theater and performance art. Like Robert Wilson, his plays are not, modern drama. They're mostly about art and multimedia stuff. There still is underneath what they show you something they want to influence the audience with or influence themselves with, and that influence towards the other, this is very General Semantics, you want to do it to another person, that is what action is. And I'll say one more thing and then I'll stop talking, about general semantics. From the little I know about general semantics, it has to do with really making yourself better, yes, with regard to language, but in general, because we are so into our habits of every day. We repeat those habits. As teachers, we teach the same class. We're often on automatic. General semantics is about being conscious. Korzybski knew of George Gurdjieff, who has work like Stanislavski, that is the work we do on ourselves. Stanislavski said, first you work on yourself in actor training, and all your ideas, and the way you move, and the way you speak, all those voice and movement classes, and then you're allowed, usually, to work on the role. So, a definition for me, tell me if I'm wrong, you guys, about general semantics is more, my husband will balk at this, but it's not the golden rule, it's the platinum rule, which is this: do unto others as they would have you do unto them. Not do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's about you, me, 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 me. General semantics is about how you treat others. Isn't it? Do unto others as they would have you do unto them. In fact, I'll end with this. Gurdjieff, I keep saying that, Gurdjieff has one thing that he said. He's a mystic from the Caucasus that some very famous writers and artists followed in the early 1920s, 30s, and 40s in this country as well as in Paris, where he had his workshop. But he said a lot of things. He said you should always do everything that others ask of you, unless it's going to kill you. Because you know what? Others ask you to do things, it's no skin off your nose. We get into conflict with people because we don't want to do the little things they ask us. And in the theater, conflict is the basis of everything, right? I'll actually end on this. This is a line I heard from my teacher. All these people are in my book. Ron Burris, who worked with my other teacher, Stella Adler, for many years. He said, once you know how to do something well on stage, in the scene, in the play, you know exactly what not to do in your real life, right? Because you want conflict on the stage. That's what makes you happy. That's what makes the theater so exciting, is that conflict. You don't want that conflict in your real life. And so I think general semantics is largely about how to make yourself better, semantically and in other ways, in your real life. Do things for others. All these things I put together in the book.
I'm fascinated. Some of the things that you said just now resonated with my reading of especially the early chapters in the book, and talking about yourself in terms of both theater and as a communication scholar were really evident, I think, in here. And you know, I felt at times reading this, and I feel right now very much a student listening to you talk about particularly the theatrical aspects.
You don't want to play the teacher.
Well, I have to confess that of course some of the names are familiar, and you can tell by my mispronunciations that others are not. But you know, reading some of the names that you have in here from sort of a communication background, you have I.A. Richards, for example, on page 25, and you put I.A. Richards in conversation with Stanislavski, and of course the Stanislavski aspect of this idea on this page is slightly out of my depth, but I was very curious. It says, for example, it's in a footnote here, it says, Stanislavski believed the actor reached the creative state through conscious work that established some sort of communion with the superconscious, and that true inspiration was thus born of conscious preparation on the role. And it struck me that that this sort of conscious and superconscious aspect relate to the way that general semanticists talk about going up and down ladders of abstraction, from the objective level where we have experience but perhaps can't understand all of the experience and can't sort of create a mental map of all the atomic level and sort of biological level things that are happening in any given moment. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is where I feel very much the student in asking you this. Some of the things in the book talking about translation are attempting to reach down much deeper into yourself to find, I mean, for lack of a better word, this sort of motivation. Like, you can write the words on the page in order for someone to recite them, say, but that without reaching into the underneath of those words to go, into a much more, go down deeper to the objective level to find out what the motivations and what it feels like and what is spurring the action, right? You talked a little bit about, from translation into action, and it strikes me that that's a lot of what's happening in here. Is we're talking about translating between languages, but also translating between experience and language, and how that motivates action and the dramaturgy that follows that in the book. Am I wrong about that? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Well, the translations are based on the circumstances that the characters find themselves in. So a good translator of the theater, differently than novels or other media, wants to understand they think, these famous ones especially, Tom Stoppard, Michael Frayn, well, Michael Frayn does speak Russian, they think that they understand Chekhov's situations that are often about love and money and sex and power, all the things that we care about in our regular lives. They think they understand the circumstances that the characters are fighting about. But you touch on something else that I write in the book about translation. I discovered in my writing and research, that most translators who are considered really good ones, and I read about a lot of different theater translators, they say that intuition or communion with Chekhov, some of them have actually said, is how they translate. They feel like they are on another plane. It's not just translating words brick by brick. George Steiner, who wrote this wonderful book called After Babel, says that there really isn't anything as translation. Pain in French is not bread, and Heim in German is not home, because in different languages those things mean very different things to us in different cultures. Chekhov, the first pages of my book, about the first thing about translation, I quote Chekhov. He never wanted his things to be translated because he says the Germans, the British, the Italians, none of these people understand, the Americans, especially in a lady's translation, which will be atrocious. He didn't want anybody, he doesn't think anybody understands the Russia of Lepahin, or the Russia that he was talking about. They don't understand Russian culture. How can they translate? But people who do translate, I think I'm trying to answer your question, there's a sense of intuition that they have, as well as just knowing or not knowing the source language. So I write a lot about that. And Stanislavski, the actors here will know this, he had this idea about communion, that actually there are exercises you can do to have a communion with your partner on stage. Here's an example of it. Maybe some of you have done this, because you were talking about a deeper thing. If I stand up and I turn my back to you, the exercise, and there's somebody else, like another actor 10 feet away from you, the exercise is they have to silently, as they can, take a step, and I have to turn around at the instant that they have taken that step. So the idea is that somehow, I can't hear it because they're doing it very quietly, but if you, how many of you know this exercise, actors? Am I the only, okay, a couple of people, yeah. If you can turn around and see them the instant they're taking the step, you have a communion. And the thing is, you can practice this for 10 minutes or half an hour, and by the end of it, you do whatever you need to do in your mind, and you turn around, and it's incredible. they're turning around at the same time at every single moment. Let me just mention another thing like this. It has to do with Peter Brook and communion. Peter Brook had an exercise he did with 1,000 people in a stadium. And he said, this is what we're going to do. We're all going to stand up at exactly the same moment. So he sits down, and he doesn't tell them how this is going to be. And everybody stands up, and he says, okay, did we all stand up exactly the same moment? Everybody in the stadium laughs. No, they didn't. Let's try it again. And they do it again, and they do it again. By the third time, everybody was standing up at the same time. And they didn't do it by going, 1, 2, 3, let's all stand up. They all just went from their asses in seats to standing up. And he says, you see, we can do that with 1,000 people. He said, actually, if we worked on this for a half an hour or 8 hours a day for 3 days, you would find that you could get large groups of people to do things together where you never thought this would be able to happen. Because people use their peripheral vision, you have a communion with others. So this was an idea from Stanislavski.
I'm curious about, so there's a passage a little bit later that I'm interested in that also involves Stanislavski. It puts Stanislavski in conversation with Aristotle, as a matter of fact, in the action part of the book. But it's a bit about character, and it strikes me that what you're talking about now, those exercises, are a way, and are they a way to get you in character, so to speak? That communion that you have with other actors on the stage in order for the performance to derive from somewhere deeper than the words on the page is to find ways to communicate at a level below where the language occurs.
Well, having an action is simply trying to influence others. And if you both know, if you're in a scene and you know the words, it's called rehearsal.
Yeah.
It's called rehearsal. You practice it enough. And I just saw a wonderful show, Alice by Heart, at MCC. It's another version of Alice in Wonderland. It has beautiful choreography, and people are flying across the stage, and people catch them. How do you do this? How does Cirque du Soleil work? Well, they've done it 46 times already, probably 3,000 times already for Cirque du Soleil. The more you work with people, this is why, films work or they don't work, because you don't really have rehearsal so much in most films, but that's what you do. What was the question?
No, I was curious about, in particular, those exercises. The idea of being in character has something to do with, talking about the inadequacy of words on the page and how you can exchange words on the page between translations or between versions of something, and rather than having it be a recital of a script, to have it be something that's derived more authentically from the depth of the character you have to assume. Being in character means to be in communion with other people in a way that is beneath the words. That's above the words.
In the quoting Stella Adler here, and Udo Hagen, in the circumstances of that character. In other words, you're pretending to be in the circumstances. That if you're really good at pretending that this person has murdered your father and you're going to get back at them, you're pretending that they did that, so you put that on the other person and you want to murder them.
Scary.
Kids do this all the time. I'm playing cowboys and Indians, I'm pretending to do this. The putting yourself in real circumstances is how you play the actions. And of course, I talk about this in the book too. There are lots of different ways that you learn how to rehearse. There's something called endowment of props. If this is I don't want to go there. But if this is a pen that belonged to my father who might have passed away, I'm going to treat this pen differently than if it's something that, they gave me on the street and it doesn't work anymore. So the way you handle props, the way you deal with people, depends on the past that you, this is Stella Adler, of course, and everybody else, the past you create for that character, and you pretend that this has all happened to you. This is why there are books out there, 2 of them I mentioned, called How to Read a Play. We shouldn't read plays the way we read novels. I mean, plays are just dialogue, right? But when you read them, you have to know that the words are the last thing that the character has said. They say certain things because, as they call it, the backstory has happened to them. This person killed my father. It's the first scene of the play. Hi, how are you? You're going to say hello to that person differently than if you didn't have some kind of past that affected you. Does this make sense?
It makes sense. It makes perfect sense to me.
So, but what interested me about what you were talking about, Aristotle, Aristotle's Poetics. I talk about that a lot in the book because Aristotle is the one who came up, I say in here, I think, with this idea of action. He said that action is the most important thing. It's not language, it's not, he has like 7 things that he thinks go into drama in the Poetics, but action is the most important. And I think other people, like Francis Ferguson, a wonderful critic that actually was a cohort of my teacher Stella Adler too, writes about the fact that Aristotle came up with this idea that we feel something inside, and so it comes out in words. Words are the last thing we say. And your words don't come because the language is whatever it is. It comes from an impulse, Grotowski would say, deep inside of you that forces you to speak. In fact, in actor training, the first thing you do is learn how to play, at least in some of my actor training, is play things silently. You don't even use words. You're not allowed to use words. If you can't do it with your body and the sound coming out that is not if you can't do it non-verbally, the teacher says you can't do it with the words. This must be familiar to a lot of people here who have had actor training. So theater is not about the words.
I'm fascinated by, some of the business in the action section about Aristotle, which you've started to talk about, is really interesting to me, which is what prompted me to start with the Heraclitus read that I did. Because one of the things I try to understand in this, and I think I've come to understand better from the experience of reading this, is it says, well, you mentioned Ferguson already, yeah?
Francis Ferguson,
right.
If you don't know, famous critic. He's passed away a long time ago, but he was at the same time of Harold Clurman and Stella Adler, when they all went to Russia, and Russian teachers like Boleslavsky came back here. Francis Ferguson and Maria Uspinskaya, he took classes with them and Lee Strasberg, Stella, Harold Clurman. You may or may not know the group theater. Sorry.
No, that's okay. No, it's good background. You mentioned Ferguson here. You say Ferguson states that Aristotle knew that the poet in the act of creating his or her play has to be an actor. The doing of an action forces him or her to imitate each character in its own inner being and believe the situations just as a good actor does, while Aristotle uses the term action or praxis to designate sequential movements of the drama. This movement inherent in the play informs the actor's individual character actions as well. The character has a purpose behind his behavior, just as the play has a purpose which drives its plot. And one of the things that when I started thinking about this Heraclitus connection, is the idea that you have Chekhov, you have the source material, and of course there's variations in the translations, and certainly each actor may have some leeway to perform the character differently. And just to sort of refresh this, I think I took my sticky note out, but it says, we might enlarge this contention by pointing out that one may not step in the same river twice, not only because the river flows and changes, but also because the one who steps into it changes too, and is never at any two moments identical. And it strikes me that you want some loyalty, I suppose, which is why people try to commune with the spirit of Chekhov in order to perform this properly in some way. But what's the latitude in both the translation as you're creating a new stage performance of some source material that exists, both in terms of direction and performance and so forth? How does that work? How do we jive those two things?
The two things are...
So what you wrote in here about Aristotle and the idea that you are channeling perhaps a character, that you're...
The translators
Yeah.
told me that
Yeah.
Jean-Claude Van Italy I interviewed, he said he channeled Chekhov.
Yeah.
He's a very kind of 60s hippie guy. But he was sued for copying Anne Dunnigan's translation. So I don't know what he did.
Channeling somebody.
I mean,
Yeah, I don't know that actors would say that I'm channeling
Sure.
Chekhov, but they know the circumstances of the play.
Sure, and the word imitate struck me, I think, is one of the words that struck me, is that there's a certain level of imitation, but, I think that you can derive from reading this that that's not exactly how acting or how performance works, is that there is some level of imitation of those emotions and things, but you try to authentically experience some of it. You try to bring it out as much as possible, yeah? Am I wrong about that?
I'm smiling, I'm looking at Catherine here. My teacher was Stella Adler, hers was Lee Strasberg. They hated each other. The idea of putting real emotion into, is this a question?
No, good, yes, please.
Real emotion on stage as an actor is a controversial one.
Yeah, I see.
Because Lee Strasberg and Stella thought very differently about this. Stella Adler, by the way, famous acting teacher, is the only one to have actually worked for 5 or 6 weeks with Stanislavski himself when they met in Paris when she was a part of the group theater. She says you play actions in a role, in circumstances. Lee Strasberg thought that, yes, like you said, you do feel what the character feels, or it's not going to come across, am I saying it correctly? It's not going to come across as real to others. But here's an example of how people disagree with that. My Russian teacher, Yevgeny, this is one of the best things he ever said to us. I thought it was so true, but I told this to an acting teacher who's more, I guess, Lee Strasberg, and she said, no, it's not. What do you think of this? What do you think of this? Yevgeny said, unless you're crazy or you're lying, an actor only feels one of two things on the stage. You feel good when it's going well, and you feel lousy when it's going badly. And when I heard that, I said, yeah, you could be crying your eyes out on stage and you're thinking, thank God, right, Catherine? I got it up tonight. I'm actually crying. This is great for the scene. But I told this to Tina Packer, who's a famous friend and cohort of my voice teacher, Kristen Linklater. They started Shakespeare Company together, and I did a workshop with her in a conference last year. And when I said that to her, her face was like this. That's not true. I feel what the character feels. How could you possibly? The character's not real, I said. And she said, it's real to me. So, sorry, she didn't say it exactly like that. But this idea of, yes, you can, when you play, Stella's idea, when you play actions, when you put yourself in real circumstances, your emotion, it looks like you're really going to kill the person. You actually really cry because you're pretending really well. But other people say, no, you feel what the character does. So I feel like I'm telling you stuff that is about actor training, and you're not.
No, I'm fascinated by that. It is.
And I don't mean to be patient.
No, no. I'm fascinated by it, and actually, one of the reasons that I was interested in it is because in talking about translation, talking about the transition from translation to action, I was very curious about how, if there's a sense that, I'm sure there's varying opinions about this, but if there's a sense that there are boundaries within which you're allowed to do Chekhov, right? Both in terms of translation and in terms of the translation of the script into action, or whether there's generally accepted that each performance is allowed a wide latitude, or each translation, each sort of linguistic translation is open to a wide latitude.
They're all different.
Yeah.
And some of the latitude, as you say, that people take, there are some translations of Chekhov where they have Lepahin say to Renevskaya, "Fuck you!" Now, I know that Chekhov never, I know
It's like my classroom.
I know that Chekhov never wrote "fuck you" in any of his plays.
Yeah.
But when you say latitude, they can do this because Chekhov's in the public domain.
Yeah.
People do. There's one play called Aunt Vanya, where they make Uncle Vanya a woman. I went and saw that one. It was interesting. As one of the famous translators in there, Stanislavski, says, even from the worst production of Chekhov, I learned more watching actors move in space than I would ever learn from anything that was ever written about Chekhov. So the answer to your question is yes, the latitude is huge if you're translating someone who's in the public domain. I mean, Tom Stoppard, Lanford Wilson, Brian Friel, David Mamet, these people do incredible things with Chekhov. And I make a big deal about punctuation. We know, Tom Stoppard said in one of his plays, The Invention of Love, he's quoting A.E. Housman, the poet, which is what that play is about. He says, there is life and death in a comma. If you've read the book called Eats, Leaves and Leaves, Eats, Shoots and Leaves by Lynn Truss, I mentioned that. It's a book about the importance of punctuation. When an actor sees an exclamation point at the end of a line in a script, they're going to, learn it differently or try something different than they would if it were, a dash or a period. So people take incredible, well, the whole book is about the latitude, as you say, the indulgences people take with Chekhov, because he's in the public domain, and they can write whatever they want. But I find these things fascinating, and sometimes they work on stage. Has anybody seen the play Moscow, 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 Moscow by Hallie Pfeiffer? Famous person. She's written a number of plays. She does a play of it's called Three Sisters, but what she does for 3/4 of the play, she has all the three sisters speak what we call the subtext. In Chekhov, I love you, or I love you. He'll have a line, but it doesn't mean what the words say. It means something different. Excuse me, I got to get out of here. And what you mean to say is something else. I was just kidding with that. The words don't. It's your action when you say the words. You get this idea, right? That is what the play actually means. And so, I was going to give an example of something that's gone out of my head. But the idea is what?
From Hallie
From Hallie. Oh yeah. She takes the whole first part of the play, and she has the characters say some of Chekhov's lines, some of her own, but she gives us the subtext. Chekhov may say, like Olga at the beginning of Three Sisters, I don't like this student. She's correcting papers, right, at the beginning of the play. And she has Olga say, fuck them, I never want to go back to that fucking school. That's actually almost a quote from her, because the whole thing is fuck and shit, you know, the whole thing is, what are those words called?
Profanity.
Profanity, yeah. The whole thing, and it's really, really funny. You've never laughed at Three Sisters until you've seen Moscow, 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 Moscow. And I wrote to her and she said, oh, I want to get your book. So, but, yes, they take all kinds of latitude.
Yeah, I was really trying to derive how much latitude there was from the way that you treat some of these subjects in, you know, you go from some general descriptions of translation and action and dramaturgy into some very specific treatments of the Seagull and Uncle Vanya and the Three Sisters and the Cherry Orchard.
Yeah, all the last four chapters are explications of each play.
Everything that you've just said in you know, each of the steps that you've talked about, it appear in a very interesting way in these individual treatments. And I regret that I can't find, there was one that struck me. There was some really nice language, and General Semantics, I think, loved language play a great deal, which is why it struck me in here. And I don't recall exactly, you'll have to forgive me, I recall it's, in some way, one of the characters was calling the other character a nincompoop or a cockamamie something or other, and all the translations about the insult were really fascinating to me. And I don't know where that is exactly, but I do have. Do you know, please, if you know where that is, please find that, because I thought that was delightful.
That's about the last play, Cherry Orchard. You know, fears is called this word in French, in Russian. It's, somebody told me a Russian told me how to pronounce it, because I was doing it wrong. Netotyp?
Yeah, that's the one.
Netotypa.
That's the one. Yeah.
And there's no exact English translation of it. So the translations, the 84 translations I found of it, all use different words, and it's interesting to hear all of them. It's somewhere here at the end of, okay, it's about Fears. He's the older character.
Here it is.
Oh, okay.
It's on page 248 here. Maybe you want to look at that in the word sounds?
Yeah, for the word Najotapa, which I used to think it meant you're an idiot. It's the word idiot. But Russians have told me, no. It's not idiot. He said it's something, think of it this way. You wouldn't call a child who did something silly an idiot, right? So it's something you would say to a child who's done something wrong. So that even though some people use the word idiot, that's not how it should be translated. Okay, here are some of the translations. Fears assesses himself as a good-for-nothing. That's what most of the translations use for Nadotipa, a good-for-nothing. Kind of, old for us, right? You good-for-nothing. Well, that's from 1952, right? Okay. Good-for-nothing, a silly old nothing, an old muddler, a pathetic old fool, a silly idiot, a silly galoot, a silly billy, an apple pate. Do you know what an apple pate means? It's a shithead. Right? Oh, excuse me, not apple, addle-pate. Addle-pate. Addle has to do with shit, and pate is your head. That's what addle-pate is, a shithead. But they don't use that in Chekhov. A job lot, a nincompoop. Nincompoop and flibbertigibbet are from two of the famous translators who are used the most. Flibbertigibbet. It's actually, I looked this up, it's from Shakespeare, but it's used by Paul Schmidt's translations. And a nincompoop is used in a lot of translations. Yeah, you'd call a kid a nincompoop, so that one works. An absolute washout, a duffer, daft, half-chopped, half-baked, a bungler, a lunkhead, a booby, a numbskull, some kind of clown, useless lumber, and possibly a silly young cuckoo or a young flibbertigibbet.
By the end of that, I wasn't sure if she was speaking directly to me or reading.
You're not any of these
Thank
things.
you very much.
But that is one example of all the different words that they used. If you don't, Do you have other things to ask me? Because there was one other
I mean-
thing like that I wanted to read to you, so you see all the different translations. And when you're talking about latitude, people will say, you know it's about a certain thing, but they're all so different. They're like poems to me when
Well,
I put them all together.
I have to confess that I have millions of things that I'd like to ask you about this, but I do have the opportunity to see you from time to time, and I know I can ask you. It is 8 o'clock. If you'd like to do a bit of reading from this, or if you'd like to pick something out you'd like to comment on in particular, you can do that, and then certainly we'd like to open it up to questions and answers.
Yeah, want to do that. But
Yeah.
do you mind if I read
Please.
something
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
only
Please,
like
go
30
ahead.
seconds
Yeah,
long?
please.
It's another comparison of one line from Sonia at the end of Uncle Vanya, which is, she is Sonia's niece. And at the end of Uncle Vanya, if you don't know this play, it's kind of sad. They go back to the way they were in the beginning, and Uncle Vanya doesn't get what he wants, and he's very upset, and he's doing some, work on the farm, but writing work in the book, what do you call it when you learn about money?
Ledger.
The ledger.
He's writing in the leisure, and she tries to cheer him up by saying, when we die, everything's going to be better. So, there are 22 different ways of this one line that I thought were really interesting, which must mean that all these different 22 translators at the end of Uncle Vanya, they have a different way of stating this one thing that she says. So I'll just read all of them. They're like a poem. So the first one, and I'm not going to read to you all in the book you'll see who wrote the translation, but I'm not going to read all those names. I'll just read to you all these different ways that they use the words in this one phrase. We shall hear the angels sing. We shall see heaven shining in all its radiant glory. We shall hear choruses of angels and see the heavens ablaze in diamonds. All the heavens covered with stars like diamonds, all heaven lit with radiance, all heaven bright with many stars shining like diamonds, the heavens sparkling with diamonds, the heavens sparkling like diamonds, the heavens like bright diamonds, the heavens streaming with diamonds, the heavens spread out before us like a field of diamonds, the heavens all sparkling like jewels, the diamonds of heaven, the sky filled with diamonds, the sky sparkling with diamonds, the sky shimmering with diamonds, the sky all dressed in diamonds, the sky will be festooned with stars as bright as diamonds, the whole sky shining like diamonds, the whole sky studded with diamonds, the whole sky paved with diamonds, the whole sky starry with glory. We don't even use the word diamonds. And the last one from David Mamet, we shall rest to the songs of the angels in a firmament arrayed in jewels.
Wow.
Those are all very different.
Yeah.
Talk about, So, I mean, to an actor, wouldn't that be something different for you? So what should we do as actors? Look at all the different translations and bring them to the director. And the director will tell you, don't do that. We're only using this one. That's what they say usually.
Should we open to questions?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Michael.
In all your research, did you ever find somebody fluent in Russian that could translate to English, or somebody fluent in English that could
Oh, yeah.
that could
Oh,
translate
yeah.
it?
Oh, no. A lot of the translators do speak Russian. Theirs are not necessarily the most
But do they have a
interesting.
handle on English so that they can make that translation?
Sure. People who translate Chekhov who know Russian and English, they know English really well, too. The problem is, though, I bring this up in the book, is that if you're Michael Frayn or Tom Stoppard, well, he doesn't speak Russian, the plays are very hard for Americans because we don't say, hup, hup, old boy. This is the problem with people who are British, whether they know the Russian or not. And people have said, English people, British people have said Michael Frayn is the best translator ever of Chekhov, but his Chekhov plays are impossible for us. Here, old boy, give me that. You know, we don't speak like, the slang is different. So yeah, there are really good people who speak Russian who write very wonderful translations of Chekhov. In fact, I go to the Russian speakers to compare them with Stoppard and Mamet and Brian Friel, a whole bunch of people, he's Irish, a whole bunch of people who they know English but they don't know Russian at all, and I can tell from the Russian speakers to the non-Russian speakers, it's very different what they do with the translations. And then there's people like my teacher, Carol Rockamora, who has translated things, Chekhov for Peter Brook in shows that he's done. But she's a very literary translator. So when you read her things, they're very beautiful, but they're impossible for actors to say. You know, she will do what, strangely, David Mamet doesn't usually do this, but you know, the firmament in a starry something festooned with this. You know, people don't talk like that. The heavens are beautiful, and we're going to go there, Uncle Vanya, is what she's saying. So some translators will do that. Others, you know. So yeah, there's some wonderful translations by people who speak Russian. Was that answering your question?
Yeah, it's just,
Wouldn't you say that Paul Schmidt was a Russian speaker who was also very well understood theater and...
Yeah, and he uses more slang, you know, than other people. He doesn't use fucking shit.
does he use American or British slang?
He's American.
So does he use American slang?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Shall I read something else that he wrote? I don't know.
So Robin, I'm curious, so the different translators obviously have different personalities themselves. So they're going to bring, say, like a more colloquial approach versus a more formal approach based on just who they are. You know, whether they know Russian or English or whatever, obviously, and this has been my thought the whole time, it's like they probably have an agenda or a way that they want you to perceive Chekhov through their personal translation. So you have to take that into account almost every time you read a different translation, right? I mean, where's this coming from? Who is that person that delivered us? And do we base it on their personality, or do we just take off from what they've written and apply our own personalities to that? I mean, there's just so many layers here, right?
Yeah, you can do a lot with a script, no matter who wrote it. But if you
Right, of
read
course.
David Mamet's translations,
Well, just what you just read about
they
this
sound
firmament
like
thing,
David Mamet
it sounds like he was
they are David Mamet plays. It's not Chekhov's Three Sisters, it's David Mamet's Three Sisters.
But when you say firmament, blah, 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 that's a lot more wordy than most David Mamet. His things are
Yeah.
usually like this.
I know,
So
that's what's
he
unusual
must have been
about it.
spoofing on it or something.
Not in
You don't think he was
in
being
this one.
satirical or?
Well,
I don't know.
I don't
it's
know.
just
It
his
depends on what your
personality.
director wants
His
you to
style.
play.
To say firmament?
I don't know
Well, he
why,
wouldn't
of
say
course,
that.
I didn't talk to
Exactly.
Right.
David Mamet,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
know that, I know his Three Sisters a little bit better, and he takes things that Chekhov has Olga say and puts it in the mouth of Irina, and he does, in his scenes, he does stickomythia, where Chekhov has monologues. You know what stickomythia is?
No.
Mm-mm.
Stickomythia is when you have short little lines going back and forth. I love you. I hate you. You don't hate me. Yes, I do. Get out of here. No, you get out. That's stickomythia. And at the end of I think it's Act 3 of Three Sisters, where you might remember, because you were in my 3 times Three Sisters, Olga has a speech, and then Irina has a speech, and then Olga has a speech. I mean, like 3 or 4 line speeches, more like little monologues back and forth. He gets rid of all, David Mamet gets rid of all those monologues, and he makes it all stickomythia, and he even has Irina says, what all the other translations say that Olga says. So he actually takes words out of different characters. He changes the structure of the plays. Also, David Mamet, I wrote a lot about him, he doesn't put in stage directions. And in Chekhov, the stage directions are kind of important, because he also says pause, silence, ... the ellipses. Some of the translators take out all the ellipses. For the actor, that changes everything. If you say, I love you, and the next line is, I don't love you, and there's a pause in between, I love you. I don't love you. You know, there's a pause there. And Chekhov has a lot of pauses. People that don't have the pause in there, I love you, well, I don't love you, it's a different action. You're playing a bit of a different scene. So, and if you take out the ... like in Nina's final speech, which they say is the hardest one in dramatic literature to ever play, where she says, I'm an actress, no, I'm a seagull. Chekhov has it filled with ellipses, which gives the actor a moment to realize something's happening there. You know, there's an action that needs to be played. You don't just pause and do nothing. I'm a seagull. No, I'm an actress. I just decided that my ellipses would be me hitting my head, but other people will do it other ways. So, of course, and this idea you said about the personality of the playwright, this is a very controversial issue. One of my friends, who's a great Chekhov scholar and does speak Russian, Sharon Carnegie, she said that playwrights who translate Chekhov without knowing Russian, but they know English, like Tom Stoppard, Mamet, etc., they don't want to lose themselves in Chekhov and actually get to what he was talking about. They want their personality to be in it because they have this ego going on that they're this famous playwright. And they get paid for translating, but they do it from literal translation, where some Russian speaker has come, not a theater person usually, has come in and translated the play word for word, just so Tom Stoppard or David Mamet or
With like
one of these
no agenda,
people.
just like here's the words. This is what it is.
Here's
But there is no
words.
way to have an action. I mean, there is no
Right.
word that absolutely corresponds to an English word. It's all subject to interpretation.
And you know what? Everything, this is in my book too, everything we do or say is subject to interpretation, even intralingually. Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you understand where I'm coming from? Maybe my action is to just get this over with because I'm so nervous to talk to my friends about a book I wrote. Or maybe my action is to impress you, you know, to think of...
What do you have?
You can let that go.
And I should mention, by the way, that copies of Robin's book are here for sale at the wonderful price of $25 per copy, and Robin will generously sign copies of the book for you at the conclusion of our question and answer period.
And I must say for my friends that I'm with an academic publisher. They charge a lot more, you know, than the Strand would charge for this book. So I'm sorry about that. I'd rather you pay $5 for the thing. But
It's worth much more than that.
but I'm doing that so I can recoup a little. But I thought 25 might be doable. But you don't have to buy it.
How long did you actually work on this? Because it started out as your thesis.
10 years.
10 years.
But I wrote most of it in the last 6 months. After I'd gotten out of the hospital and I was better I was 5 years away from my brain injury, and I was going to prove to everybody that I still had my brain.
But I mean, you
So
had your dissertation, and then another X number of years that you
Oh, no, I graduated with my dissertation. I got my PhD in 2007, and this was actually ready to go last September.
So it took
So all-
over
but I
10
made-
years
Yeah.
to really pull it together.
Yeah, well, all those intervening years, I was looking for work, and I was teaching 9 classes a year at a
But also
community
you
college.
expanded a lot from the dissertation. I assume you
Yeah,
enhanced it.
I
and-
changed things.
Mhm.
Most of it's the dissertation, but I found some
Mhm.
things that I forgot to change. But,
Robin, did Lowell get to see any of it?
no, he didn't. I was there, he was there when he was gone by the time I graduated, I think. Lowell Swartzel was the guy a professor I had in educational theater, where I was teaching for Neil Postman, but I was getting a degree supposedly in educational theater. Lowell didn't get to see nor did Nancy, because she helped me a lot too, get to see the final product. Nor did Neil. Neil was the head of my dissertation committee until he died, and then Deborah Borisoff. So,
I find it fascinating that there, words are words, but there's the rhythm of the words that makes such a difference.
Yeah.
And that, I
rhythm
mean,
is the most
when I played Renyevskaya, it was important to me which translation they used, because Schmidt you can memorize and it has a rhythm.
yeah, he's
Nakamura
American.
didn't work for me. Yeah.
You know who else? Who other people hate? When I was first studying Chekhov, Jean-Claude Van Italy, that's his name. His was the easiest to say because he also has an American rhythm to his words. But, and this is true too, another translator who I'm seeing in Malta, where I'm presenting my book in April, he's coming with me. He says that Jean-Claude Van Italy makes all the characters sound the same. Because when one character is, loves money and always is trying to get it, and another character, is chewing tobacco all the time, and another character is a drunk, Chekhov writes them all differently. That's what a good writer does. Every character is different. But when you're translating, sometimes the translators, they even say this, I wanted to smooth it out. And other people say, you don't want to smooth it out. You want everybody to sound different. For the actors,
Because that's not, that's not life.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it's not exactly a question, it's a comment, because Mike, I think that you did absolutely understand exactly what, and to read with, when you said that the map is not the territory, I didn't realize that was so central to the study of general semantics, so now I'm going to have to do more research into general semantics. But absolutely, that's the heart of it.
And I thought it was Marshall McLuhan who said that, but he got it.
He says a lot of things.
Is Terry still here?
I'm right here.
Oh, okay. I thought it was your dad who said that, but he did mention it many times. Do you understand that? The map is not the territory?
No.
If you have a
Why don't you
treasure
translate
map,
that for me?
this is a map. This is but the map doesn't,
what it is.
is not what the territory is when you go out in the desert and you walk and you dig up the actual thing. That's what I use that to say that a play script is not the play. It's not a play till it's been performed. But a lot of people disagree and say, no, the play is written. I can buy the play. I can sit home and read it. It's just the same as if I saw the play. No, it's not.
No. There's so many levels of interpretation. I mean, there's the translation, there's the director's idea, there's the actor's idea, there's the idea of the scene fitting together. It's so multi-layered.
Can I ask a question? I think you were touching on this earlier when you were talking about all of the different interpretations that different translators, and then the actors have their interpretation. And where does the latitude and where does it become a conflict between the author's intent and the latitude that translators and actors take? So
What was Chekhov's intent? Get him in
But
here.
the thing,
Let's
well,
ask him.
exactly. Like whenever you ask that question in rehearsal, your director will say, hey, you can't know what the author intends. But to some degree, you want to be true. You don't want to go so far away from the truth of the play.
Of the story.
What does
the
Austin
story.
Pendleton say about it?
Austin doesn't say a lot. He lets you pretty much do, he'll let you know if you're off base, but he leaves actors alone pretty much.
So is Chekhov like, I know it when I see it? Is that the rule in general?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I really don't know. I always have this quandary myself as an actor. I'm always very conscious of what I think the playwrights. Yeah.
And that's your opinion.
Well, what the truth
And that's your research.
What the truth of the play is, in the story. What the
But,
truth
but
of
when
can
it's
read
a translation,
things
there's an extra layer. because
exactly, and then the actor has a layer
It's
also. So
influencing.
I think it's like where are the boundaries in terms
Can I
of
read you what
interpretation?
Ian McKellen, who is considered
Yes.
from the biggest Chekhov actor who's still alive, what he
Ian
says
McKellen?
about it? Okay. This is what he says, and it's all true. He says, the big problem with Chekhov is that we don't do Chekhov, we do translations of Chekhov. Very few translators, at least those I've work with the original. Instead, they come from literal translations. It varies. Pam Gems doesn't know Russian, while Michael Frayn and Richard Cottrell both do. That explains the skepticism about English or American or German actors talking about playing Chekhov. It's constantly frustrating not to know how close you are to Chekhov's intentions.
Yeah.
Also, you cannot be certain about the rhythm. So Pam Gems and a lot of other translators adapt Chekhov.
Yeah.
In my book, I talk about the difference between version, adaptation, and translation. They cut him without you knowing. When you're doing a production, you are very much in the hands of the translator as well as the director. So you cannot connect the plays in the way that you might connect Shakespeare's, where the acting problems are common to all the works. I cannot say that about Chekhov's plays because I've never read them. It's a major problem. That's Ian McKellen. So, yeah.
Did you talk to Irene, or did you ever meet Sonia Moore?
Yes. No, Irene.
But Irene, did you talk to Irene about this? Did she
Yes.
have an opinion?
I did. It was a long time ago when I was still at NYU.
Yeah.
So I talked to her more about actor training and her mom, really. But I still have the tapes. I could play them and answer that question.
Can I give Lance an opportunity to ask you a question?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask about translation itself. And we said the map is not the territory. I mean, the idea is that words are not things that they are supposed to represent, and language is not reality. And sort of a corollary to that, and kind of related to general semantics, is linguistic relativism, or otherwise known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, so that different languages are different maps for the same territory, different ways of representing the same territory. And they can't really be translated, which is why you don't become fluent in another language by going back and forth with word substitution. You have to actually think in the other language. You sort of, I mean, McLuhan would probably say you would put it on like you would a suit of clothes. So when we look at that
That's
problem,
in my book.
well, you look at the problem of translation then, and that underlying that is not, I mean, many of the examples that you bring up are examples of vocabulary, word substitution, but that the more significant aspect of differences between languages in grammar, that grammar is the structure of language that changes the way that we look at the world. So I was wondering if you have references to the differences between Russian and English grammar, and how that affects the translation?
That would be another great book after I've learned Russian. I know that Russian has declensions. If you have blue eyes and you're talking to a 10-year-old, it's different, and it's a Tuesday, you use a different verb form than if you're talking to an adult and it's a Sunday and they have green eyes. I'm just making that up, but the declensions are very different. No, I don't compare those because I don't speak Russian.
But is that a factor in the translations?
Of course. And not only that,
Everything's a factor.
Russian culture and things that have happened in Russia are very different than have happened in all the other countries, France, Germany, and the United States, who translate Russian. So an example of that would be, here's one thing that you would have to know. You would only know this because you were Russian. There's a character, you would know this, named Petya or Trofimov, they all have several names, who is called the perpetual student in the cherry orchard because he hasn't graduated. He's been going to college at the University of Malta for many years, and he's teased throughout the play for being a perpetual student. But the thing is, at the time in 1902, whenever Chekhov wrote it, people were activists. This was right before the revolution, right? So there were a lot of people in Moscow, students included, who were activists. If they thought you were an activist, they wouldn't let you graduate from the University of Moscow. So actually, it's not that Petya wants to be a perpetual student and that he's not doing his work or taking the right classes in order to graduate. The audience would know that he hasn't graduated because he's spoken truth to power at the University of Moscow. But you would never know that side of the character unless you'd done your research and were from the Russian of the time. So, yeah, these things are really important, and not knowing the language, yeah.
How about the verb to be, which is so significant, in general semantics as a problem? Isn't that true?
I don't know what it is in Russian.
Isn't it treated differently in Russian? That the word is...
I don't know. Does anybody here speak Russian?
And the problem being the essentializing quality of the verb to be.
Right.
Where we equate things, that we give them an essence, the essence of the, right? Is whether they do that in Russian or not, I have no idea.
And by the way, for those of you who don't know, this is a big question in general semantics because it's not a good, we use the word to be or is all the time in English when we don't really mean that, or mostly it's untrue. She is an idiot. No. What you mean is, I don't like what this person says, or for whatever reason, there's something negative about that person. But when you use the word is in English, you're saying something about that person's whole being, and it's largely untrue. So we use the word is very summarily, and it's peppered throughout our language when that's not a good thing to do with people, to say what they are or aren't. Isn't that part of general semantics? And it's part of time binding, which I think is the idea that over time we can get in our personalities and the way we treat people, we can get better and better and better. There's this idea, because this is Gurdjieff also, that we should get more conscious about the way we treat others and the things we say to others. We should be more thoughtful and reflective rather than spouting off things that hurt other people. This is a big idea of general semantics that you should know. It's also part of the Gurdjieff work. Looking at yourself and saying, how many times did I say things today that might have hurt somebody? It also goes along with the Course in Miracles. Many of you know that too. You know the Course in Miracles? No? Well,
Of the presidential candidate.
Yeah, I was just going to say she's running for president. No. She's an interpreter.
Marianne Williamson.
Oh, Marianne
Yeah,
Williamson.
she's an interpreter.
Anyway, that's a different subject. But you should know that, and I have to say, all the people here today who know about General Semantics, what I know of them is that they live their lives that way. They treat people with this idea that we have to treat people better. That is Mike and Lance and Tom and George and other people. I mean, this is how they are. They're actually doing the Grizzlies work, whether they know it or not. Anyway.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and please join
Oh,
me.
woo!
I hope you felt some hospitality of our small group and of these events, and we'd love to see any of you come back and join us in the future. They're always quite interesting, and available nysgs.org is the website, and
March 20th for the next.
March 20th for our next meeting.
I sent it to everybody.
And I believe Robin will be signing books and so forth, and I'm sure she'd love to have an opportunity to talk with all of you in the time we have left in the room. So thanks very much again.